I stared at my phone, unable to believe what I had just read. The message from Dad was short, cold, and entirely devoid of any explanation. "We're selling your childhood home." My fingers hovered over the screen as my mind tried to process the words. That house wasn't just wood and bricks. It was every memory, every milestone, every fragment of my childhood carefully stitched into walls, windows, and the creaking floors. I could almost hear the laughter echoing from birthday parties long past, the smell of Mom's cooking drifting from the kitchen, the quiet evenings where we sat together, pretending everything was perfect. A wave of disbelief hit me. How could he do this? Hadn't I lived through years of neglect, yet still somehow loved this home as my sanctuary? My mind spiraled through moments I had long tried to forget. The Christmas mornings where I had opened presents he barely noticed. The family dinners where my siblings' laughter always drowned out my voice. The little victories he never acknowledged. It wasn't just about selling a house. It was about erasing the last tangible connection to a place that had made me feel safe, if only for fleeting moments. The betrayal stung worse than I expected, a mix of anger, hurt, and nostalgia crashing into me all at once. I sank onto the couch, my eyes tracing the outlines of familiar furniture in my rented apartment, imagining the rooms I would never walk through again, the walls that had held my secrets and dreams. The sheer audacity of the message made my stomach churn. And yet, beneath the shock, a tiny ember of determination sparked. I couldn't let this go unnoticed. I couldn't allow the memories of my childhood, both beautiful and painful, to be discarded without a fight. Something inside me shifted in that moment. The quiet realization that this wasn't just a text. It was the beginning of a story I would no longer let him write alone. A story where I had to reclaim my voice, my past, and whatever dignity remained. As I sank deeper into the memories, the weight of my childhood pressed down on me. I remembered the way Dad's eyes always lit up for my sibling, the way their accomplishments were celebrated as if the world itself owed them admiration, while mine barely drew a nod. Every time I brought home good grades, it was met with a polite smile. Every time they achieved something, it was a spectacle. Birthdays, recitals, graduations. I existed in the background, a quiet observer of their applause. I gave everything I could to the family, often sacrificing my own happiness just to keep peace, to fill gaps no one else noticed, to help silently. No one acknowledged the countless nights I stayed up helping with projects. The afternoons I spent tutoring a sibling who didn't thank me, the way I cleaned, cooked, and kept the house running without complaint. I had learned early that love in our family wasn't about recognition. It was conditional, selective, reserved for the one who naturally drew attention. And yet, despite the neglect, I remembered feeling a faint hope, a naive belief that one day I might finally be seen. The house Dad now wanted to sell was more than walls and memories. It had been my quiet refuge from favoritism, my private sanctuary where I could exist without judgment. I remembered the late nights sitting on the porch, clutching a notebook, writing down my dreams, hoping someone would notice who I really was. And there was the time I stayed up to make my siblings' birthday special, decorating the living room while they slept, only to be dismissed the next morning. That small heartbreak repeated itself over and over, teaching me that love in my family came with conditions I could never meet. As these memories flooded me, I felt the old ache in my chest, the deep, lingering hurt of being overlooked, the silent suffering that had shaped who I became. But alongside the pain, a flicker of understanding arose. These experiences had forged me, honed my resilience, and built a quiet strength that no favoritism could break. I began to see that the neglect I endured wasn't just loss. It was preparation, a shaping of a person capable of finally standing up when the world tried to push me down. The anger and sadness were real, but so was the realization that I wasn't powerless, that I could finally claim what was mine, not just the house, but the recognition and justice I had been denied for so long. I couldn't stop thinking about that text, the casual cruelty in those 6 words, and something inside me demanded answers. I started digging through old papers I had kept from my childhood home, the letters, the bills, the documents I had taken when I moved out, thinking they might matter someday. My hands trembled as I unfolded an envelope I hadn't opened in years. Inside were neatly stacked letters and legal papers, the kind you never think you'll read, but somehow hope never exists. My stomach turned as I recognized Dad's handwriting, authoritative and final, committing to something I had never been told. He had secretly promised the house to my sibling. Every sentence was a blow, each paragraph a reminder that all the sacrifices, all the quiet loyalty, had been meaningless in their eyes. They had planned this without me knowing, never considering how it might feel, never thinking to ask, never acknowledging my presence in the life I had lived within those walls. The betrayal wasn't just about the house anymore. It was the realization that even my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, had placed me last, carefully writing me out of a future I had imagined for myself. Memories of helping my sibling move in, of celebrating milestones that weren't mine, of silently enduring favoritism, all of it came crashing back. Anger and disbelief mingled with hurt, a cocktail that made my hands shake as I tried to process it. The sense of invisibility that had haunted my childhood was no longer something I could shrug off or quietly bear. I felt the full weight of being overlooked, dismissed and betrayed by the person who should have loved me unconditionally. Every document, every line, screamed that my life, my loyalty, and my memories had been ignored. Yet beneath the initial shock, a cold, sharp clarity began to form. This betrayal, though painful, illuminated a path. If they believed they could erase me, I would make sure I wasn't just noticed. I would take control. The seed of resolve planted itself in my chest, a promise that this injustice would not go unanswered. The house was more than a building. It had become the battleground for recognition, respect, and finally, my voice. That evening, I reluctantly agreed to join the family for dinner, telling myself I would keep it casual, keep my emotions in check. The moment I stepped into the dining room, the air was thick with the usual pretenses, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, and the silent hierarchy I had learned to navigate since childhood. My sibling arrived first, already the center of attention, regaling Dad with stories of achievements I had long ago stopped celebrating out loud. I tried to join the conversation, offering small updates about my work, my life, anything that might earn a nod. Instead, I was met with polite indifference, a quick glance, and a swift return to my siblings' triumphs. Every word they spoke was met with laughter and encouragement from Dad, while I felt like a ghost at the table, unseen and unheard. Subtle insults slipped into the dialogue, disguised as jokes or offhand comments, cutting deeper than any overt attack. My efforts to engage were dismissed, my successes minimized, my contributions invisible. I caught myself flinching at phrases like, "Well, you know how sibling always excels," or, "Don't worry, you tried your best." Tried my best. Those words echoed mockingly in my mind, highlighting years of being underappreciated and overlooked. Even the smallest gestures of kindness I extended went unnoticed, while every achievement of my sibling was celebrated with grandeur. The realization hit me anew. No matter what I did, no matter how much I sacrificed, they had never truly valued me. Anger, hurt, and longing mingled in a potent, almost tangible brew inside me, each memory of past neglect rising to the surface. The house being sold felt like the final insult, but this dinner was the mirror reflecting decades of favoritism and neglect. As the evening drew on, I forced myself to smile, to nod, to play along, but the familiar ache of invisibility gnawed at me. I left the table not just hungry, but suffocated, the sting of being unvalued burning sharper than any confrontation could. And in that quiet humiliation, a seed of resolve began to grow, a simmering determination that someday they would see me, and it would not be on their terms. Once I was alone, the walls of my apartment seemed to close in, echoing every slight, every dismissal I had endured. I sank onto the couch, phone still clutched in my hand, rereading Dad's message as though new layers of betrayal might appear if I looked long enough. Anger bubbled up first, sharp and consuming, the kind that made my chest tighten and my hands tremble. How could they be so thoughtless, so dismissive of everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed? Then came the frustration, a heavy, lingering ache that settled in my stomach. Years of being overlooked, minimized, and taken for granted rose up in a tidal wave I couldn't control. I replayed memories of birthdays they ignored, accomplishments they brushed aside, moments where I had bent over backward to support the family only to be met with indifference. Loneliness followed, the quiet ache that had been my constant companion, finally allowed to stretch and breathe. It wasn't just tonight. It was decades of invisibility, of feeling expendable, of giving everything without ever being seen. I found myself whispering into the empty room, questions I would never speak aloud. Why did they always love my sibling more? Was there something wrong with me? Internal voices, long suppressed, began to argue. Accusations, regrets, and the longing for justice. My mind shifted, circling darker thoughts, considering measures I had never dared before. What if I confronted them in a way that could not be ignored? What if I acted boldly, decisively, in a manner that would finally make them recognize my presence and my power? I felt a cold thrill at the possibility, the danger, the audacity of taking control of a narrative that had been written without me. Every option felt extreme yet oddly necessary, as if only something drastic could correct the imbalance, repay the years of neglect, and assert the value I had always carried but they never acknowledged. My heart raced, my hands shook, but beneath it all, a quiet determination began to take root. I knew that the coming days would demand courage, cunning, and the willingness to step into a realm I had previously only observed from the sidelines. The cliffhanger lingered in my mind. Was I willing to cross that line? The thought both terrified and exhilarated me, promising that whatever I chose next, nothing would ever feel the same. The next morning, I returned to the stacks of papers I had begun combing through, determined to find something, anything that could shift the balance in my favor. Hours passed as I meticulously sorted bills, letters, and legal documents, my eyes scanning for inconsistencies, hidden promises, or any sign of favoritism that could be leveraged. That's when I found it. A series of financial statements showing unequal distributions, unreported gifts, and expenditures made solely for my sibling while I had been left to manage on my own. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. This was more than favoritism. It was proof, undeniable evidence, that my sacrifices had been ignored while privileges were granted to someone else. I felt a spark of exhilaration, the first flicker of control I'd had in years. For the first time, the power wasn't entirely in their hands. I could confront them with facts, with irrefutable proof that I had been wronged. My hands shook slightly as I organized everything into a neat folder, imagining the look on Dad's face when I presented this information. The tiny victories of my past, small accomplishments and quiet perseverance, suddenly felt amplified, validated in the harshest possible way, with cold, tangible proof. I allowed myself a brief smile, the kind I hadn't given freely in years. Status, which had always been stacked against me, began to tilt, if only slightly, in my favor. I imagined the ripple effects this evidence could create. Subtle unease at family gatherings, doubt creeping into conversations, and the dawning awareness that I was no longer invisible. That night, as I closed the folder and leaned back, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The first power reversal had begun, a small but crucial step in reclaiming what was mine, and proving to everyone who had doubted me that I was no longer a passive observer. This was only the beginning, but it felt like the turning point I had been waiting for, the moment when the balance of control finally started to shift. I knew they thought I was powerless, that I would sulk quietly and let the house slip away without a fight. They had always underestimated me, counting on my silence and compliance, just like they had throughout my childhood. That assumption fueled my determination as I made a quiet appointment with a lawyer, careful to keep it secret from the family who believed they had already won. In the sterile office, I spread out the documents I had gathered, feeling both nervous and empowered as the attorney flipped through each page with a practiced eye. Then came the revelation. There were loopholes, obscure clauses buried deep in legal fine print, that could grant me partial ownership of the house. My heart pounded as the implications sank in. Suddenly, everything Dad and my sibling had assumed was certain. The house slipping completely from my hands was no longer a foregone conclusion. I could stake a legitimate claim, one that would make them reconsider their arrogance and the casual cruelty with which they treated me. A mix of disbelief and vindication coursed through me, a powerful adrenaline that mingled with long-suppressed anger. This twist wasn't just about property. It symbolized the first time I had truly turned the tables. The family's plan, which had seemed airtight, was in fact riddled with vulnerability, and I now held the key. I pictured Dad's smug face, my sibling's confident smirk, both of them blindsided when I emerged from the shadows armed not with brute force or drama, but with facts, strategy, and the law itself. For the first time in years, the balance of power felt negotiable, malleable, and thrilling. The knowledge of my partial ownership ignited something in me, a readiness to play a long game, to reclaim what had been denied, and to make them realize that I was no longer a passive, overlooked child. This was the midpoint, the shocking realization that their superiority had limits, and that I, finally, was ready to exploit them. I started with a list, not of grievances, but of moves. If the house was going to be a battleground, I needed a plan that was emotional, legal, and social all at once. I called Mara first, my oldest friend who had watched me shrink and then slowly grow. "They think this is settled," I told her, voice low. "But I'm not done." She didn't hesitate. "Then stop being quiet. We'll draft everything. Timeline, witnesses, proof. You won't go in alone." Her certainty settled something in me. I was no longer invisible to someone who mattered. Next, I met with Jonas, an old coworker who knew numbers and people. Over coffee, he asked, "What's your endgame?" I told him I wanted recognition, not revenge for its own sake. "Then be surgical," he said. "Public pressure without chaos. Lawyers will handle the claim. We handle optics." He sketched a rough plan. Discreetly reach out to neighbors who remembered repairs I'd made. Gather old receipts, and subtly plant the idea that the home wasn't just real estate. It was community heritage. "People like a story they can root for," he said, tapping a napkin where he had drawn a timeline for publication of facts and friendly interviews. I rehearsed conversations. I practiced saying, "I want my childhood home to be honored, not erased," until the line felt true and not theatrical. I wrote down the facts that hurt most, the promises never made to me, the secret documents, the late nights I scrubbed floors while others celebrated. Writing clarified the narrative. It wasn't a rant. It was an outline of injustice with dates and witnesses, a storyboard for how I would present myself when the time came. There were awkward calls with my cousin Elena, who had always been sympathetic but terrified of family drama. "If you do this, will it destroy relationships?" she asked. I admitted it might. "Then let it," I told her softly. "They destroyed the relationship years ago by pretending I didn't matter." Her silence was a small victory. Someone else finally grasped the depth of my quiet suffering and agreed to be available if needed. I hired a paralegal recommended by the lawyer who had found my loophole. The woman, quiet and efficient, taught me how to file statements without inflaming a courtroom spectacle. "You want the record to show intent, inequality, and precedent," she explained. "Leave theatrics to them. We build a paper trail that's impossible to ignore." The legal steps calmed some of my rage. I found solace in methodical action. This was not a tantrum. It was a case. But the social plan was the part I found most fulfilling. I reached out to neighbors who had watched our family over decades. One elderly woman remembered when I had mended her fence after a storm, when I was still a teenager carrying more care than credit. "You always were the quiet one," she said, "but you had backbone." Her words became a public anecdote I could lean on, a portrait of a person who had given more than she was acknowledged for. We also prepared for the inevitable gaslighting. I asked friends to be ready to correct the record if Dad or my sibling attempted to rewrite history. Texts and emails were organized, timestamps noted, all small pieces of undeniable truth. I learned to convert memory into evidence without stripping it of feeling. The plan respected my need for justice and my fear of becoming a monster in my own story. Dialogue became rehearsal. I role-played confrontations with Mara, practicing calm and clarity instead of fury. "If he says you're being dramatic," she would prompt, "I say I'm being truthful." If my sibling accused me of making trouble, I practiced answering, "I'm asking for what I've always deserved." Each exchange hardened my resolve and softened the edges of my anger into purposeful communication. As the days passed, the disparate threads of emotion, law, and social proof braided into a coherent strategy. I felt less like a wounded child and more like someone reclaiming narrative control. There was a growing tension beneath every conversation and message sent, a humming readiness for the confrontation ahead. I could already imagine the look on their faces when I stopped being invisible, when I stepped from the margins into the center of the story I'd been living all along. The plan wasn't reckless, it was calibrated. Still, as I closed my notebook that night, heart thrumming, I knew the real test was approaching. It wasn't just about documents or anecdotes anymore, it was about courage. And courage, I realized, was quieter than anger but stronger, waiting for the precise moment to move. I rehearsed the moment I'd say it aloud, feeling the weight of every memory in the cadence of my voice, knowing that word by word I'd reclaim a life they'd tried to erase. And then, finally, I would begin. Now. I told myself I would keep the meeting. Casual, just a family catch-up to avoid arousing suspicion, so I suggested Sunday lunch at the old place, the restaurant Dad liked. They accepted with the same breezy confidence they always showed when they assumed nothing could touch them. I arrived early, folder in my bag, heart steady, but focused. Mara sat 2 tables over with her phone down. Jonas pretended to read ER newspaper but had his eyes on the door, and Elena sat quietly in the corner, ready to speak if needed. Dad walked in first, chest puffed with that familiar paternal certainty. My sibling followed, laughing, already practicing their triumphant smile. For a moment, I felt the old pull to shrink back, to let their performance wash over me, but I stayed and gave my own smile. Calm, measured, controlled. We ordered, made small talk, and I listened to the same stories retold with a new gloss. Then I put down my napkin, slid the folder across the table like it weighed nothing, and said, "I think there are things we need to clear up about the house." My sibling looked up with casual annoyance. "What now?" they asked, expecting a fluster. Dad tried to smooth it over with a joke. "Oh, which house? You mean the one full of our happy childhood?" His tone was light, but their eyes searched mine for weakness. That was their mistake. I opened the folder and began to speak slowly, each word chosen to land cleanly. I explained the documents I had found, the financial statements showing uneven distributions, the letters promising control to my sibling. Without consultation, the paralegal's notes about a legal loophole that could give me partial ownership. As I spoke, Mara casually placed a printed copy of a neighbor's statement on the table. Elena slid her phone across with timestamps of messages Dad had sent that contradicted what he had told others. The table filled with small, undeniable proofs. My sibling's smile faltered first. They tried to laugh it off, hurling a sarcastic remark my way, but the sound came out thin. Dad's face, which had been a calm mask for years, cracked into confusion, and then something worse, recognition of the problem. Around us, other diners began to quiet. A voice dropped the usual hum of background conversation, because the energy at our table had shifted. The public element mattered. I had wanted witnesses because I knew they would be less likely to gaslight in front of a room that was already listening. I watched my sibling grow smaller with each piece of evidence presented: receipts, emails, witness names. Their defenses became clipped, their comments sharp but hollow. Dad, who had always been authoritative, found himself explaining in circles, making statements that Elena or Mara could immediately counter with facts. Every contradiction tightened the noose of accountability. It wasn't about humiliating them for sport. It was about exposure, making the truth visible and undeniable. I saw pride give way to embarrassment, and embarrassment to anger that couldn't hide the vulnerability beneath. When my sibling attempted to stand and storm off, Jonas calmly mentioned that neighbors had already been asked to comment, and that there was a timeline of repairs and favors that many had seen. The mention of community recognition landed like a public announcement. Heads at nearby tables turned, and murmurs threaded through the room. By the end of the meal, the dynamic had shifted. The smug certainty that had sat between us for decades had been punctured. They still tried to assert dominance, but it sounded thin, rehearsed. I left the restaurant with my folder, my pulse steady, and a quiet sense that the balance had finally begun to tip. I had not yet won the fight, but I had exposed the truth in a place where it could not be entirely denied. And that small, public unraveling was everything I needed right then, and they would never forget. The day of reckoning arrived with an electric sense of inevitability. I walked into the attorney's office with a folder heavier than my nerves, every page a piece of my history, every document a weapon of truth. Dad and my sibling had no idea I had requested a mediated meeting with a neutral witness and our lawyer present. I could almost feel their smug confidence, the invisible crown they had worn over me for decades, waiting to be toppled. The room was neutral, but it pulsed with tension, every chair arranged to make sure nothing could be hidden. I didn't need theatrics. My presence and preparation were enough. As we sat, I began calmly, almost conversationally, recounting years of overlooked achievements, subtle betrayals, and unequal treatment. I cited specific examples: birthdays ignored, contributions dismissed, opportunities redirected to favor my sibling. I presented receipts, letters, and the legal loophole that granted me partial ownership. My words were measured, but their weight crushed the air around us. Dad's attempts to interject were met with citations of documents that could not be disputed. My siblings' usual arrogance dissolved into a tense silence, their earlier smugness replaced by a nervous twitch in their jaw. I could see the shift, the balance of power tilting, the confidence I had long lacked, now radiating from my every word. The lawyer guided the conversation toward resolution, but the public witness ensured accountability. Each fact I revealed was a sting of truth, leaving no room for excuses. I watched as Dad's face, always confident, registered shock, frustration, and finally, the humiliation of being caught favoring one child over another. My siblings' attempts to joke or deflect crumbled against the irrefutable evidence I laid bare. Then came the pivotal moment. I spoke of the house, not as property, but as a symbol of every unseen effort, every sacrifice ignored, every moment I had been pushed aside. I emphasized that reclaiming it was not about vengeance, but about recognition and justice. Their reactions were raw: anger, disbelief, and the sudden awareness that they had underestimated me at every turn. I paused and let the silence fill the room, letting the weight of years of neglect and favoritism settle heavily on them. The satisfaction was quiet, not gloating, but absolute. Karma delivered not through chaos, but through the undeniable truth that I had finally claimed my rightful place. The shift was complete. No longer powerless, I felt a surge of vindication that mingled with relief. They were faced with the consequences of their actions in a way they could not ignore. The meeting ended with agreements drawn, concessions acknowledged, and a clear reversal of status. I walked out with a calm certainty, knowing that justice, silent, factual, and unassailable, had been served. The humiliation they endured was real, but deserved, and for the first time, I felt the exhilarating balance of power restored. I had turned years of neglect into a decisive victory, and the satisfaction of karmic justice coursed through me like a quiet, triumphant heartbeat. Weeks after the confrontation, I stood in the living room of my childhood home, now partially mine, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and memories. It wasn't perfect. Dad and my siblings still had their spaces, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, I felt seen, acknowledged, and valued. Walking through the rooms, I touched the worn banister where I had learned to climb, the windowsill where I had spent countless afternoons writing and dreaming, and a wave of gratitude and relief washed over me. Justice hadn't arrived with fireworks or vengeance. It came quietly, in recognition, in truth laid bare, in my ability to assert myself without losing my integrity. I reflected on the journey, the years of neglect, the favoritism, the loneliness that had shaped me. They had made me resilient, intelligent, and strategic, able to navigate obstacles with patience and precision. I realized that claiming partial ownership wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming my voice, my past, and my sense of self-worth. The documents, the witnesses, the careful planning, all had been tools to prove what I already knew. I mattered. Sitting on the edge of the living room sofa, I allowed myself a moment to feel proud, not in arrogance, but in quiet acknowledgement of the strength I had discovered. I no longer carried the ache of invisibility. My family had been forced to recognize me, not as an afterthought, but as an equal. And the satisfaction was deep and moral, more enduring than any fleeting triumph. Looking out the window at the garden I had once tended silently, I smiled at the realization that empowerment could be quiet, strategic, and satisfying all at once. This house, partially mine, symbolized more than property. It represented validation, closure, and the personal growth I had earned through years of endurance. For the first time, I felt truly at peace. I sat in the quiet of my childhood home, now partially mine, letting the memories wash over me like an old photograph come to life. The laughter, the tears, the unnoticed sacrifices, they were all etched into the walls, the floors, the air itself. I realized that while the house could never erase the years of neglect or favoritism, it could hold the proof that I had endured, survived, and ultimately reclaimed my place. My past was unchangeable, but my response to it was mine alone. I had learned to confront betrayal with strategy, to turn invisibility into strength, and to demand acknowledgement without losing my integrity. As I traced the familiar corners with my fingers, I understood that empowerment wasn't just about victory over them, it was about embracing who I had become. I was no longer the overlooked child. I was the architect of my own justice. And though some scars would remain, they reminded me that growth often comes from pain. I felt a quiet pride, a sense of moral satisfaction, and an unwavering clarity that the future was mine to shape. For anyone who has been undervalued, dismissed, or ignored, I hope this story shows that survival is powerful, and reclaiming your worth is possible. The past may have tried to define me, but the present, and the life I choose moving forward, belongs entirely to me.